Sports are full of big moments that can make or break professional athletes' careers. Like back in 2012 when for a very short period, Linsanity took over the NBA and turned Jeremy Lin into a household name almost overnight. Or when Odell Beckham Jr. made that fantastic one-handed catch. I mean, that's kind of become his brand now for nearly a decade. While many athletes are able to rise to the occasion on the biggest and brightest stage, there can also be serious repercussions if things go awry. One mistake, one bad play, and in this day and age, that can be all you're really remembered for. If I even just look at racing, NASCAR specifically, Juan Pablo Montoya is a world-class driver, a world-class racing champion, but his NASCAR career is most remembered for the 2012 Jetfire incident. So while the big bright lights of pro sports can be your best friend, they can also be your worst enemy. And so being a NASCAR-focused channel, I wanted to look back at one of the most critical night of one young driver's career. I want to talk about how one Daytona race in the summer of 2018 turned Ricky Stenhouse Jr. into the biggest punchline in NASCAR.
This is the finish these fans came and stayed for. Ricky Stenhouse, the pride of Olive Branch, Mississippi. Stenhouse wins it! Woohoo! What a run!
Before we focus specifically on that 2018 race, let's give some important background information about Ricky Stenhouse Jr. Early in his NASCAR career, Ricky Stenhouse drove for Jack Roush, who was recently inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame for being one of the greatest owners in series history. And while Ricky Stenhouse Jr. showed promise early on, things weren't all hunky-dory. In fact, infamously, the story goes, he was parked early on in his Xfinity Series career because Jack Roush feared he was wrecking too many cars. A little foreshadowing, perhaps, into what would come later in Stenhouse's career. But after that brief time on the bench, so to speak, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. rose to the occasion and won back-to-back Xfinity Series, then Nationwide Series, championships in 2011 and 2012. And so being the two-time defending Xfinity Series champion when Matt Kenseth left Roush Fenway at the end of the 2012 season, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was the obvious choice to replace him in the 17 car, and in 2013, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was a rookie in the NASCAR Cup Series. Unfortunately, Ricky Stenhouse Jr.'s young Cup Series career did not go nearly as well as his Xfinity Series career. He was winless in his first 4 full-time seasons in the Cup Series. Some of it was him, some of it was Roush Fenway Racing. With the new car being introduced in 2013, the Generation 6 car, it seemed pretty clear from the very beginning that Roush Fenway Racing had fallen behind the 8 ball compared to other superpower race teams. And as their veteran championship contending drivers like Matt Kenseth, Carl Edwards, and Greg Biffle left the team over those next several years, Roush Fenway Racing's overall performance took a serious dip. But that being said, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. broke through in 2017 and emerged as a super speedway sage, if you will, winning 2 of the 4 restrictor plate races on the schedule that year. He got his first career win in the spring race at Talladega Super Speedway, and then just a couple short months later actually won the summer Daytona night race. While Roush's performance at other tracks over the years had declined, it was clear their super speedway program was still top notch. So after 2 wins in the 2017 season and a playoff berth for Ricky Stenhouse Jr., he entered the 2018 season with a lot of confidence, hoping to expand on their recent success. But 2018 for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. did not go according to plan. In his preseason duel race before the Daytona 500, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was involved in this incident with William Byron, aggressively side drafting through the tri-oval, gets the 24 car squirrely and leads to a spin and a wreck. Just looking at this move in retrospect even, I mean, it's hard to put all the blame on Ricky Stenhouse Jr. He's just trying to pass a guy at Daytona by side drafting, which is what you're supposed to do in these cars. It's aggressive, but he's got to do what he's got to do. But you'd hope at least Ricky Stenhouse Jr. would learn that maybe side drafting like that in the corner is perhaps risky, that these cars aren't handling it too well. Nope.
He gets a run, gets into the corner. Oh, same exact situation as he crossed over, basically just turning these cars sideways when you get that close and pack air in the left rear.
Again, ducking out of line last minute and aggressively side drafting the car in the turn, of course, is going to make that car unstable. So that led to a wreck and led to some people questioning whether Ricky Stenhouse Jr. had learned anything from his duel race. In the Daytona 500, Stenhouse made a very aggressive block, and that set off a chain of events behind him.
No, Jones not going to be able to save.
Jones did not.
Ricky Stenhouse Jr. coming off of 2 restrictor plate wins the year before. You knew he was aggressive. You knew he believed that he could win the Daytona 500 that year. You know that he went to all the super speedways in 2018 with an added sense of urgency. They weren't run very well at the 1.5 miles at the short tracks, at the road courses, so they needed to do the best they could do at the super speedways if they wanted to make the playoffs. So let's fast forward now to that fateful night in July of 2018. The Coke 0400 at Daytona, the last super speedway race before the playoffs were set to start in September. This is the night that Ricky Stenhouse Jr. became a NASCAR meme. Ricky Stenhouse, as people would call him. The night began really well actually for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. He won the first stage of the race in dominating fashion, but then just a few laps later on lap 54 out of 160, things started to go wrong.
Just waiting for whichever line. Huge push. And around goes a 2. Too big of a push. He caught the 41.
The big one.
Logano's caught up in it.
Oh my goodness.
Denny Hamlin. Austin Dillon has damage. Daniel Suarez trying to avoid. Ty Dillon sliding in.
Now this is a difficult wreck to analyze. It's a big one. It's a classic NASCAR Daytona big one. Like half the field was involved at least. But it's difficult to analyze, and I'll be honest, because you can't put all the blame on Ricky Stenhouse Jr. here. Yes, he was pushing the 2 car extremely aggressively. Yes, he kind of turned as he made contact with the back of the 2 car and hit him in the right rear, which of course he kind of should have known was going to hook him into the field.
Ricky?
But Brad Keselowski had to lift pretty significantly to avoid running into William Byron, who kind of put a late block on him. And that's what led to the dramatic difference in speed between Ricky Stenhouse Jr. and Brad Keselowski, leading to that contact and leading to ultimately the wreck. And actually Brad Keselowski, after the race, kind of took the blame for this wreck. And in fact, this was the race that Brad Keselowski then vowed to never lift for people who block late ever again. And we kind of saw that come into play earlier this year, actually, with him and Jimmy Johnson. Keselowski not lifting when someone makes a late block. But after this Daytona race, Brad Keselowski said, when you've got a guy behind you with a big enough run, you can't throw a block. And he's talking about William Byron here. I made the mistake and lifted instead of wrecking him, and that's my fault. In this race and in those cars, nobody was pushing as aggressively as Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was pushing at the time, and so it's not too surprising that maybe a slightly over-aggressive bump draft sparked off a massive crash and led to a lot of angry drivers, but we'll get to some of the other drivers' reactions later. Anyway, that was the first major incident of the night that Ricky Stenhouse was involved in, but like I said, and I think most people can agree looking at that clip, you can't put all the blame on Ricky Stenhouse Jr. there. You can put a good amount of it. I'd say probably half, maybe, in that percent. You can put a good percentage on Stenhouse, but you can't put all the blame on Stenhouse. But it was a huge crash that left a lot of fans angry, a lot of fans looking for somebody to blame. A lot of fans already didn't like Brad Keselowski, but a lot of fans already knew a little bit of the history about Ricky Stenhouse Jr. But what sealed the deal for NASCAR fans watching at home was the wreck that took place just a few laps after this one got cleaned up.
Oh my goodness!
Sideways the 18, hard into the wall. Around goes the 24 as well.
Freaking wreck 18 and
Guys, I'm afraid to say it, but I think Stenhouse was involved in this one as well.
I do too.
And this wreck, there's no excuse here. That's 100% on Ricky Stenhouse Jr. I don't know what he was doing. To this day, I still don't know what he was doing. He was probably trying to side draft Kyle Busch, which is already a little sketchy to do, especially that aggressively when you're in the center of the turn. But he clearly just kept moving up until he hooked the 18, who hooked him into the 24, and ultimately Ricky Stenhouse Jr. took the lead as a result of this wreck, which only added insult to injury, I think, knowing that the guy who caused the carnage was now running up front, and actually Stenhouse then won stage 2. So Stenhouse swept the stages in these races, but he had to take out more than half the field to do it. This wreck was the most egregious of the night, and the fact that it came just a few laps after the first big wreck that Stenhouse had a part in certainly was not a good look for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. and led to him becoming the villain of the night, without a doubt, without question. Kyle Busch on the radio, of course just seconds after the wreck, so still in the heat of the moment, said, "He's such an effing dip. What an effing waste of effing space." Absolutely laying into Ricky Stenhouse Jr., and parts of that were actually played over the NBC broadcast, censored and whatnot, but it only continued to fuel fans' animosity towards Ricky Stenhouse Jr., who had now swept both stages, but wrecked over 20 cars, or at least been somewhat responsible for the wrecking of 20 cars in the process. Now, before we get to the rest of the post-race reaction from drivers, from fans, from everyone, let's talk about the rest of this race, because Ricky Stenhouse Jr. at this point was one of the few cars still chugging along. On lap 124, Kyle Larson blew a tire and spun out in front of the field, collecting only one other car, but that car was, of course, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. Nothing Stenhouse did wrong in this case, nothing Stenhouse could really do, but just maybe karma, if anything. But Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was not out of this race yet. Oh no, he's still going. And as the laps were winding down on lap 149, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. cut a tire down, likely from some of that damage from the Larson incident, and brought out the caution all by himself. Just one final chance for fans watching at home, fans in the stands, to point and laugh at poor Ricky Stenhouse Jr., who was having the worst night of his NASCAR career. And that still was not the last wreck of the night Stenhouse at least got a piece of. The final wreck of the night, which set up a final green-white checkered, Ricky Stenhouse was not involved in the wreck, but did get a piece as a bunch of cars in the front of the field went spinning and wrecking. So again, not Stenhouse's fault, but man, he was involved in 5 cautions that night. And at least 3 of them, he played a major part of bringing the caution out. He ended up finishing the race in 17th, so he didn't even DNF. He was involved in 5 wrecks and still finished the race. I mean, credit to him, he at least persevered. But needless to say, he did not make a lot of fans happy, and he certainly did not make many of his competitors happy after the race. Here are just some of the post-race reaction on Twitter. Chris Lambert, Denny Hamlin's spotter, posted, "Well, congrats at Stenhouse Jr. You're 2 for 2 in causing a big one at both Daytona races this year, but you're 2 for 2 just tonight. How about you learn to race him, not wreck him? That thing has 2 pedals in it for a reason." Unreal. Goodness me, that looks like one of the fake generated tweets in NASCAR Heat when you make a driver mad during career mode in a video game. I mean, he's laying it on pretty thick. Kurt Busch tweeted that night as well. "Thank you everybody at Stewart Haas Racing. Car was fast. Sucks we got caught up in the hashtag StenhouseDD Demolition Derby, but it's a product of him being 17th in points and racing for every point." You got a former champion there calling you out as well. So not a great night for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. on, or quite frankly off the track. Now afterwards, during his post-race media availability, in post-race interviews, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. accepted blame for at least some of the wrecks from that night. But even then, I feel like he never really offered like a genuine apology. Among his post-race quotes, Ricky Stenhouse said, "It's crazy here. We're trying to get into the playoffs, gaining points and trying to put ourselves in position for the win. We tore up all of our other Ford teammates. It didn't go as planned." He then later said, "We needed to win to get into the playoffs, so it is what it is." And now in the days and actually a couple of weeks following this night, Kyle Busch, who of course was taken out probably the most egregiously by Stenhouse at Daytona, he was unhappy with Ricky Stenhouse Jr. because Ricky never reached out to him the week after to apologize or to even talk about that wreck, something that Kyle Busch was not a big fan of. This led to kind of an awkward interaction at Kentucky a couple weeks later with, I don't know, Stenhouse kind of giving Kyle Busch a pat on the head. Certainly, in my opinion, not the best look that Ricky Stenhouse Jr. kind of refused to apologize for any of the incidents, because like I said, the one with Kyle Busch, I mean, Stenhouse was a pretty blatant mistake. That one was all on Stenhouse. The other one with Keselowski, I mean, I think you could put some of it on Stenhouse, but to fully blame him for that is unfair as well. All in all, it was a rough night, and a rough several days after that night for Ricky Stenhouse Jr., one that completely changed the conversation around his name. Since then, memes like the Ricky Stenhouse Demolition Derby, the nickname Ricky Spinhouse, those have become synonymous with his brand, unfortunately, for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. And last year in 2019, at the end of the season, Roush Fenway Racing, his longtime team, finally just let him go. Seemingly in the middle of his contract, seemingly out of left field, swapped Ricky Stenhouse Jr. out for Chris Buescher. And Stenhouse this year, now with a brand new team, has had some great performances. But if you remember this year, the first race after the pandemic, on lap 1, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. wadded it up at Darlington, trying to make a 3-wide move, and the car got out from under him and he spun out. Ricky Stenhouse Jr., since this Daytona incident, has not done much to kind of repair his reputation among NASCAR fans. If you want my opinion, I do think fan reaction to that 2018 Daytona race for Stenhouse was slightly overblown. I remember watching that race on TV, following along on social media, following along the weeks after, reading articles and watching TV segments, and I thought the hate for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was a little bit overblown. Like I said, the wreck with Kyle Busch was 100% just a dumb mistake that you don't see from a Cup Series driver. Call him out for that all you want. That first wreck that tore up 20 cars, I still don't think was 100% on Ricky Stenhouse Jr. I thought people throwing all the blame on Stenhouse for that one was also unfair when, Brad Keselowski in the wreck blamed himself for it. So I don't know. I think that was a little blown out of proportion. But honestly, though, in the last 2 years since that night, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. has not really repaired his reputation too significantly. Stenhouse, from his early beginnings, like I began this episode talking about, when he first started racing in the Xfinity Series, he was known for making aggressive mistakes and occasionally wrecking the car. And that's never really gone away. That's still always been a small part of Ricky Stenhouse Jr.'s driving style, if you will. But in no other race has it reared its ugly head the way it did at Daytona in 2018. That was the night that Ricky Stenhouse Jr.'s reputation perhaps became irreparable with NASCAR fans. It's a shame to see, because just a year earlier at that very same racetrack, that very same race, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was in the middle of a breakout season with 2 wins. He was emerging as a super speedway superstar. And just 1 year later, all that basically got tossed out the window. It'll be interesting to see, as Ricky Stenhouse Jr. is still a very young driver compared to most, what his career holds from here on out. Can he ever overcome the Ricky Stenhouse moniker? Can he ever get fans to forget about the Stenhouse Demolition Derby of 2018? Can he earn himself a top Cup Series opportunity, or is he doomed to just run for mid-pack teams like JTG Doherty the rest of his career? Time will tell with Ricky Stenhouse Jr. I hope I've been fair in this video to Ricky, because I honestly am a Ricky Stenhouse Jr. fan. I don't love everything he's done, but I was a Matt Kenseth fan for years, and I watched Ricky Stenhouse Jr. dominate the Xfinity Series for a couple of seasons, and when Matt Kenseth left to go to Joe Gibbs Racing, I thought Ricky Stenhouse was a solid enough successor to put in the 17 car. I mean, he just won 2 straight Xfinity championships. Like, why not? But as time has gone on, it's clear that he has not learned, or he's not developed as quickly as I was hoping he would. But I still want the best for Ricky Stenhouse Jr. He's been in the Cup Series for now, this is like his 8th season. He's had a lot of great moments, and I think he has a good personality to have in the NASCAR Cup Series. So I hope one of these days he figures things out, maybe with age, maybe with just more experience, maybe with working with new teammates, new teams. Perhaps Ricky Stenhouse Jr. can start to turn that image around and maybe have some success here further down the line in his NASCAR career. But there you have it. This was my dramatic retelling of, what should I call this video? The night Ricky Stenhouse became a NASCAR meme. I mean, that's basically what it is. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you are new to the channel. We talk about NASCAR almost every single day on this channel, so you're in the right place if you like watching cars go in circles. Follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. A big thank you, of course, to my fantastic Patreon supporters. I'll see you all in the next video. Should be pretty soon. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.